As I keep saying, this whole thing gets more and more like a movie franchise by the day. We have a new entry now. I don't know if you want to call it a thriller or an action movie or a tragedy or horror or what it is, but it appears there has been a mass terrorist attack in Moscow in which a group of armed men attacked a concert hall that was holding a rock concert and gunned down over 130 people. We'll see what the ultimate death toll is. They apparently set it on fire. Some of them have been captured, some of them have been killed, and there's basically complete and total chaos. Now, as always, we have to wait 24 to 48 hours to tell what actually happened. And it's probably going to take longer than that because there's always all kinds of people are shocked, they have PTSD. Sometimes people are just missing, they're not necessarily dead. There's chaos, all kinds of people are rushing, trying to cover their asses, and they're going to claim all kinds of stuff. So just whatever you hear, we have to take it with a giant salt mine because who knows exactly what happened. We do know that there was an attack and a lot of people died, but let's just wait to see the details clear up. That being said, whenever one of these attacks happen, the question immediately comes to mind, who was behind it? And to try to get into that, I guess kind of the logical way, if we don't have any direct forensic evidence, that is, we don't have like an email from the Caliph of ISIS saying, pull this one off, guys, or they've done background checks, they figured out all the guys behind it were former ISIS or are members of ISIS or ISIS sympathizers or something. The question comes to mind, who's in a position to gain, who's in a position to lose, what's going on in the geopolitical picture, what's going on in Russia, what's going on in the Middle East. There's a lot of stuff going on, and in the absence of anything definitive, and maybe even if there is something definitive, because it's not implausible that ISIS could be working alone on, could be working with someone else on this one, as they have in the past. But that being said, let's just kind of go through the potential culprits and the various motivations involved. So the first, and I'm not going to rank these too much by likelihood, but probably the vanilla answer, the answer that very well could be true, is that this whole thing is just exactly what it seems. ISIS pulls this kind of stuff all the time. I believe that this was ISIS-K, which is kind of like the special K version of ISIS, and they're primarily focused on mass terrorist attacks like this, whereas the other branches of ISIS are more involved in active insurgency and attempting to establish the Islamic State. So if we recall, during the whole conflict with ISIS in the Middle East, they would do stuff all this all the time. They were very fond of these shock and awe tactics, where they just kill a bunch of civilians, or they'd blow monuments up, or something like that, in an attempt to get international attention. And the world is focused on Moscow at the moment, and if they wanted to get a lot of attention, a lot of prestige from their cause, this would make sense. Russia is also one of their major enemies because Russian air power was critical in the Syrian government being able to defeat ISIS and regain control of much of the country. It was definitely involved in the collapse of the Islamic State and its territory. So it very well just could be ISIS. I mean, I think ISIS did one of these in France a while back. The other thing to keep in mind about ISIS and Al Qaeda is it's as much an ideal or a brand as it is an actual organization. That is, if you are an Islamic terrorist and you want to go do something, you say you're part of ISIS, at least ideologically or in spirit, so you can feel like you're part of a bigger organization. There's also cases, I would imagine, where there's just local Islamic terrorists who get support from ISIS. So what I'm saying is this: it's entirely possible that ISIS just pulled this. They were the primary people involved, either in concert with local groups, maybe some Chechen soldiers who were garrisoned there. Chechens have done stuff like this all the time in the past. So that's entirely a possibility. That's not beyond the pale. That kind of thing happens all the time. Now let's get a bit more into the conspiracy theory. So what are some things that have been happening recently? Well, Putin recently won re-election in a landslide. Whether you consider that legitimate or not, it's a massive W for him personally and most of his allies or countries he's neutral with have acknowledged his victory and congratulated him on it. He has also announced that Russia is moving out of active defense or aggressive attrition, as Alexander Mercouris calls it, and at some point in the near future, they're going to be switching to some sort of major offensive. I've also been seeing a lot of other just stuff, like we have the whole Macron, are we going to send troops to Ukraine? Are we not going to send troops to Ukraine? I've seen a lot of Western articles saying Ukraine lost. We had that blow up in the House where it looks like they're not going to pass the $61 billion. They're still trying to grab the assets. There is a sense of general desperation throughout the collective West, whereas Russia is in a state of optimism at this point in time. The war's going well. They very well could begin their long awaited equivalent of the 100-day offensive and cause Ukraine to collapse. And that is kind of the broader picture. We also have, obviously, the stuff that's going on in the Middle East with Israel, with the Houthis, with Hezbollah, with Hamas. It should be noted that ISIS is an unofficial ally of Israel. They are literally, I think, the only Islamist group who's not anti-Zionist or doesn't really care about Israel. During the events of the during events of the ISIS-Syria war, I think they attacked Israel once by accident and then they apologized. So there is that aspect to it, is we have an active conflict going on between countries like Yemen, Iran's kind of involved, Syria's involved, Hezbollah's involved, with a bunch of countries that are allied or friendly with Russia who are in conflict with Israel. So that's another, I think, aspect of the whole thing you have to keep in mind. Furthermore, if we're going to look into other potential suspects for this, we also have Budanov in Ukraine, who thinks that he's some sort of James Bond villain figure. He thinks he's Blofeld, and he tries to carry out insane James Bond-esque stuff all the time, not the least of which was the destruction of Nord Stream. If he was behind that, or the US was behind that, or it was just a couple guys, like it was just Gilligan and the skipper who were behind that, he's done stuff not quite this scale, but he's done stuff like this in the past. So as with the death of Prigozhin, there's a whole range of actors it could be, but maybe let's just kind of go through them one after another. Say, was there opportunity? Was there motive? How likely was it? Now, the first one I guess we would come across is that this was a false flag. That Putin and the Russian state either directly recruited these guys or they like honeypotted them. They had like the FSB informants go in and rile a bunch of people up and basically do what the FBI does and coordinate them into carrying out this attack. The idea being that they can use this as justification to go all out in Ukraine, just full balls to the wall. No more restraint, no more holding back, no more active defense. We're just going to blitz Ukraine and end the war as soon as possible. Now, that is certainly an option. I find that very unlikely. I don't think if they're winning that they would try to throw like a wild card into it. Like they're doing well. They've crushed most of the Ukrainian army. The economic situation's going well. The battlefield's going well. There's a possibility of a collapse in the next couple of months. I don't know why they would risk throwing that all away and destabilizing the whole situation by having some kind of crazy scheme like this that could lead to all sorts of different consequences. There's also the thing about the U.S. saying that there might be a mass attack in Russia, which Russia apparently ignored. To be fair to Russia, if you know anything about the aughts, this was a common thing where the U.S. would just raise the terror alert for no reason, like every other day, and they say there's a mass attack coming. And it was like a fear tactic to justify the Patriot Act and giving money to the military-industrial complex. So that's certainly it's a possibility. I don't really think it's likely. And this comes to what I like to say when it comes to international relations, that all you ultimately have is your reputation and your record of behavior. Now, the second person we could look at is, as I said, Budanov, the wannabe Blofeld of the Ukrainian intelligence agency. Now, what makes it possible that he was behind this is he's done assassinations in Russia quite a few times. He's done state terrorist attacks. Some people argue that he was behind Nord Stream. And we had this like big G Slur 24-hour op that they ran during the election where they were like invading border towns with like the fake Russian freedom fighters. And I heard from a couple different people that the goal of that was to seize nuclear weapons and put them into a bipedal walker that could launch it with a railgun from anywhere on Earth, and to hold the two nuclear weapons for ransom unless the Russians gave them $100 billion in diamonds. I'm just kind of joking, but there was a plan apparently as part of the cross-border raids into Russia with the fake Russian Liberation Army to seize nuclear weapons. And then, I mean, they can't detonate the nuclear weapons because you need the codes for that. Nuclear weapons are pretty stable, to my understanding. Unless you have the codes, then the specific thing, you can't set them off. That being said, you could still blow them up and scatter plutonium all over the place, and that probably wouldn't be very pleasant. But that apparently happened like a week or two ago. Budanov and Zelensky and company have also been talking obsessively about getting long range weaponry so they can strike deeper into the heart of Russia, so they can bring the war to the Russian front. So, was Budanov and Ukraine behind it? It's possible. I don't know, but the problem is Budanov and co have done crazy stuff like this so many times in the past that there is kind of a record of behavior here. I have not seen too many cases of Putin doing false flag attacks that would justify this sort of thing. The only one I can really think of is the death of Prigozhin, who he probably killed. Although, once again, in that place, it could have been anybody. It could have been the CIA. It could have been Russian oligarchs. It could have been Budanov. It could have been Putin. That's kind of the issue with a lot of these people like Navalny or Prigozhin or Putin or Budanov, is they have so many enemies, most of whom have at least some resources, that it literally could be anybody. So that's number two. So this could be to demoralize Russia. This could be to distract them, to prevent the big offensive from coming, to buy Ukraine more time. Maybe to get Russia to focus on ISIS and forget about the special military operation. These things all seem quite possible. And then comes the issue, if this had happened and Budanov was involved, was the United States involved? Were they issuing this warning as like a way of trying to make it look like they weren't? Well, we can go through all kinds of different levels to this. One of the problems, and once again, this is where the past is prologue, and you have to be very careful what you do on the international stage. ISIS, as we all know, was basically created by the United States. Not necessarily did they say, "Oh, we're going to make this like new caliphate," but they gave a bunch of Syrian rebels who they didn't even know who they were a ton of weapons and money and stuff, and that group turned out to form into ISIS. And who knows if they would have been able to do that without massive American financial support. Does this seem like the kind of thing that the CIA might try to pull for the reasons listed above? Distract Russia as kind of a Hail Mary, as a last throw of the dice to try to turn Project Ukraine around? I'm not sure, but it's once again, it's certainly a possibility. And the degree of rhetoric that I've seen coming out of the West with regards to how much they hate Russians, how much they want to kill Russians, how much they want average Russian to suffer, I would not be surprised if a lot of people were celebrating this and saying that they got what they deserve. It could also be European intelligence. And once again, we get into patterns of behavior and what was going on. We had Macron, who has been saying for like a month now, we're going to send French soldiers into Ukraine and we're going to put them in the way of Russian weaponry. And then once they get shot, we're going to try to invoke Article 5 or Article 9 or whatever it is and start World War III. And that was like the big plan that he had come up with, is we're going to basically do the equivalent of a false flag. to justify a full scale military intervention by NATO. And there's that whole thing with like the French Foreign Legion fighters in Ukraine getting blown up. And there was the German phone call. There's been a lot of like behind the scenes stuff going on and a lot of attempts to trick different people into doing different things. So once again, while is Macron behind this? I don't know. I'm just saying there's a lot of like stuff going on in the background. There's been a lot of desperation and a lot of calls for direct conflict with Russia recently. So it's certainly also a possibility. There's also rogue factions within the Russian government. There's also just uh, various anti-Putin groups or pro-Putin groups. We don't really know, but I think those are all the potential people. There's also obviously Israel, as Israel is allied with ISIS, at least unofficially. And they might be angry at Russia for trying to push for being kind of the main sponsor of the ceasefire resolution. And this might be their attempt to break Russia from the Muslim world and lessen their support for a ceasefire and sympathy towards Hamas. So that is the potential people who are involved in this. If you had to put a gun to my head, I'd say it's most likely is just ISIS being ISIS. I think oftentimes the simplest answer is the most accurate. Is generally speaking, does that mostly explain it? Probably. Then again, the fact that they were able to do all this in the middle of a war where Moscow is locked down so tightly, and the intelligence services are everywhere, it just seems very odd. Nothing about this really smells right, and that's beyond just it being a horrific terrorist attack. But like, if there had been something that was blown up in the Middle East during the ISIS-Syria war, then yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious who was behind it. It was pretty obvious what was going on. That kind of checked in line with general trends. This though is completely out of left field. So I don't know. You can post in the comments below who you think was behind it. I don't really know. We'll hopefully it'll come out eventually, or it could be like Nord Stream, and they'll announce who is behind it, and then everyone will just ignore it. So, anyways, God bless everybody. Pray for the poor Russians.